Today, I'm going to demonstrate how I maintain the batteries on my truck camper, which utilizes two golf cart style batteries connected in series. The purpose of maintaining the batteries is mainly to check the water level and add more water as necessary. But I also want to check the overall condition of the batteries, make sure the connections are clean and tight, and then just make sure that the interior of the battery box is still pretty clean. Now I have two 6-volt golf cart batteries wired in series. Golf cart batteries are a little bit taller than a traditional 12-volt deep cycle batteries. So I don't have a battery tray installed in my camper, so maintenance is a little bit more involved. I'll get into this a little bit more later. The other thing I can do while maintaining the batteries is check the specific gravity of the batteries using a hydrometer. Our camper is a 2015 Arctic Fox 990. It originally came installed with a slide-out battery tray. As you can see, the batteries would then, come on out and be right there for you to check water level, add more water, and check the connections and everything. So you can see how simple that would actually be. Our dealer was kind enough to offer to substitute two 6-volt golf cart style batteries in lieu of two 12-volt Group 29. I believe they were Group 29 batteries when we initially bought the camper. And if you're considering changing 6-volt to 6-volt batteries, and you're just kind of wondering how much of a hassle is it to actually maintain these batteries, that's what I'm going to cover in this video. So here I'm showing how the batteries look actually installed in the battery box. So as I mentioned earlier, I have two 6-volt golf cart style batteries, one in front of the other. I got a couple of, I don't know if you can see, but I have a couple of blocks of wood that are just capturing the batteries from sliding around. And I'll pan up here a little bit so you can see that the thing that makes it the maintenance a little bit tricky is that the tops of the batteries, there's not a lot of space between the tops of the batteries and the top of the battery box. Now it's not too bad because the battery box itself is made out of ABS, so you can kind of see what the back of the box looks like. So I got some additional wiring back in there, and that's the little thinner wires you see is my volt sense wires for my battery monitor and my solar controller. Okay, so you can see now the tops of the battery box, and now this terminal that it's in the center of the screen. I got my yellow jumper cable goes from the positive terminal of this battery to the negative terminal of the battery behind. And if you scan over a little bit here, you'll start seeing the black cable. The red cable that you see in the background goes to the battery in the back. So that should be pretty adequate to show you what I have here. And you can see that block of wood now better. How I got the batteries captured inside the battery box. The other thing I wanted to show is the main battery disconnect that's installed in my camper. I'm assuming that most campers probably have a similar disconnect installed somewhere, probably accessible from the exterior of the camper. In my case, the switch that you see right there is the disconnect that was provided by the manufacturer. Okay, so we're ready to get started. I've already made sure my batteries are fully charged, and I've disconnected my batteries inside the camper using a disconnect switch. The things you're going to need predominantly are some distilled water. You want to make sure you use distilled water and not ordinary tap water. I like to use shop towels just to make sure that you can clean up any spills that you may have. And then a suitable wrench, and in my case just a 9/16 box end wrench, or the open end wrench. And what you'll know here is that it's a metal wrench, so you want to be a little bit respectful, which is part of the reason we disconnected the battery to begin with. And we're going to start off by disconnecting the negative terminal, which is connected directly to the frame of the camper. So even if I was to short the wrench against something aluminum, which is kind of difficult in my case because the battery box is made out of ABS, but you'll also know that this wrench actually isn't long enough to jump the 2 posts on my battery. Now I have considered cutting a wrench down. I just can't bring myself to breaking a perfectly good wrench. Or you could buy a wrench that's smaller, or wrap it in tape or whatever if that's something you feel comfortable doing. I elect just to be careful. The other thing you want to make sure is you're wearing suitable clothes, and I'd like to suggest that you have some sort of eye protection, because we are dealing with lead acid batteries after all. I just trust my my normal prescription glasses, and you could even wear gloves if you think that's necessary. But as you'll see, my batteries are actually going to be quite clean. So here's my batteries, and I have them installed on purpose so that the negative terminal, the black wire, is kind of close to the opening. So the first thing I'm going to do, though, before I get started with that, is I'm going to remove my blocking. So I don't have anything fancy going on here, just a couple of wooden blocks that are reasonably tight, and actually they're taller. The blocks are physically taller than the room I actually have available. So the batteries actually, even if they jump up, they can't clear the size of my wood blocks. And after traveling down many dirt roads, washboarded and rocky and everything else, taking my camper into places I probably shouldn't take it, I've discovered that it works pretty well. So now you'll see the batteries, since it's an ABS battery box, they slide around pretty good. So I tend to bring them a little bit further forward, and I take the boxed end wrench and I reach in pretty carefully here. And all I'm going to do, they're not super tight, right? These are batteries, so it's just a couple of quick turns. You can see, I don't know if you can see, I'm guessing that the lighting's wrong, and I don't really have a good way to light this battery compartment while I'm physically working on my batteries. Okay, so that one's loose. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the nut using my fingers, so I can get my hand in there. Now it's a tight fit. So there's the nut. It's just a 9/16, probably 5/16 thread. Now I disconnected the black cable, and in my case I actually have a couple smaller wires that are used for voltage sense for both my solar controller and for my inverter charger. Now what I like to do after I remove the nut is I actually like to return it to its post. And there's 2 reasons for that. Mainly, I don't want to lose it, because losing a nut in the dirt out here would be bad. And then the other reason is that if I accidentally happen to smack the stud on the door, it's protected by the nut. So I don't screw it down all the way. I just get the top of the nut more or less flush with the top of the stud. So now I can move the battery over here a little bit, and now I'm going to remove the nut that's securing the jumper cable. So since these are 2 6-volt batteries connected in series, there's a jumper cable that goes from the positive terminal of this outer battery to the negative terminal of the battery behind. So the first thing I do is I actually have a temperature sensor. This is for my inverter charger, which is actually attached to one of my posts. And now I'm going to lift off the 6-volt jumper cable, which you'll see here in a moment, and I'll attach the like I did before. I'll put that nut on there. Okay, so now this battery is totally disconnected. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I have to lift the corner of the battery up over this edge just a little bit. I'm going to slide it toward myself, and all I got to do is just gently, carefully pull it out like so. And that's it for the first battery. I have a second battery. I can reach in, grab a hold of it. It slides around pretty nice on the ABS. And normally you wouldn't have to disconnect this jumper cable, but I went ahead and I used the same post on the battery for another temperature sensor. So I actually have two. I have a temperature sensor for my inverter charger, and then I have a temperature sensor for my solar controller. And by the way, that's, if you're considering looking into getting a replacement charger or a solar controller, and you happen to live in a cold climate, having temperature compensation is actually a good thing. I don't have the specs memorized, but it increases the voltage of the battery. I think it's 0.028 volts per cell per 10 degrees C, if I recall. And finally, I'm going to reach in now and disconnect my 12 volt. Oops. So here's my jumper cable. I went a little bit crazy. I actually made the 12 volt positive lead red, the ground negative lead black, and I decided to split the difference on color and made the 6 volt jumper yellow. This is actually 2/0 welding cable with heat shrink that's got goo in it. So I actually made up all these cables, but you know, I went ahead and selected a red since I had them. I used red heat shrink for the positive side and black for the negative side. It's totally over the top and unnecessary, but I had the heat shrink. The company I bought the welding cable from actually sold welding cable by the foot, so I was able to actually buy, I actually bought 2 feet of yellow. I could have bought a single foot and that would have been adequate for what I needed. So now I'm just disconnecting the plus 12 volts, which is my red cable, and I also have the 12 volt voltage sense wire on that battery as well. And now I'm returning the nut to that stud as well. Set the wrench aside. Okay, and like I did with the first battery, I'm going to tilt it back slightly so I can slide it over this edge. And by the way, if you know, you can actually pay a little more attention than I am in terms of the posts if you're worried about shorting those against the door of the battery box. So one thing you want to be a little bit careful of when you're pulling the batteries out, and I think you have to be careful of this even with the tray, is that you do have, this is aluminum here, and you want to make sure that nothing's going to interfere with that piece of aluminum. You don't want to jump 2 posts of any battery across. So this is all my cables. You can't really see those. So that's it for that step. Okay, so now I got the batteries out, sitting on the fender of my utility trailer. And I apologize for my dogs and the neighborhood dogs all barking and everything. So the first thing we want to do is we want to just pop open the caps. Now, if your batteries are slathered in battery acid, it wouldn't be a bad idea to you know, wear gloves in this process. But as you can probably see, you know, I got a little bit of white electrolyte. That was probably due to the equalization process. And I think it's unlikely that the camera can actually see the level that's going on here. And I thought I would try to take an inspection mirror. What you'll see is, in my case, the electrolyte is clearly, you know, covering the plates, and there's a ring inside the battery that you want to bring the level up to that level. So using our distilled water, I'm just going to top off the batteries. Now you could use a funnel, I suppose, but I figure I'm not really spilling that much distilled water. It's not terribly expensive. I'd like to wipe down the batteries anyway, so getting a little bit of water on the batteries themselves is not a bad thing. So I'm going to go over here and do the same. Okay, and that's it. So I probably used a few ounces of water total, and this camper was put up late October, and it's now April 28th. Excuse me, March 28th. Now, what I forgot to demonstrate, and I forgot to mention earlier, is you can also check the condition of your batteries using a hydrometer. I picked up a cheapy version here, I think at Napa Auto Parts, and they call it a battery conditioner indicator. And all it's going to do is it's got a number of balls in there, and it works a lot like an antifreeze tester. And I should have demonstrated this before I added water. But if the battery is fully charged, and I like to get it down in there pretty deep, kind of do a couple of them. You know, if the battery is fully charged, all the balls will float. Now, I don't think that that's necessarily going to tell you much if you know your batteries are fully charged. In my case, I have a battery monitor, so I have a pretty good idea when my batteries are fully charged. But if you're trying to troubleshoot battery problems, especially if you have two 12-volt batteries connected in parallel, then you know, some form of a hydrometer may help you diagnose that problem. So anyway, that's all it took to check the water level and add a little bit more. Now, since I have my paper towels here and I got my distilled water, I'll go ahead and I can close these battery caps. And you can see it's pretty straightforward, simple matter. Pop those things closed, and you know, I can either. This is sort of an unnecessary step, but you know, I figured I got the batteries out, and you know, if you got a lot of corrosion on your batteries, and then of course, what you do is you add baking soda to help neutralize the acid. Now, what you'll notice on my batteries here is they're actually quite clean. And you see, if you look at the posts, for example, you know, there's no corrosion on these posts, and these batteries, to, you know, put it in perspective, have been in my camper for actually I got it in March of 2015. So these batteries have been in my camper for 4 years now, and I installed my solar system. Actually, I installed my solar system before I actually took my camper out for the first time. So these batteries have been in my camper and more or less being charged continuously since I got my solar system installed, which would have been, you know, in the late spring of 2015. So, and I camp a fair amount. As an example, I had the opportunity to take a 6-week road trip back east last fall, and except for a few nights, I was completely off grid, and I use my batteries pretty heavily. I may have mentioned earlier that I actually have a 2 kilowatt whole house inverter in my camper, which means it actually powers up all the outlets. And as crazy as it seems, I can actually run my microwave for short periods of time off my inverter, you know, on the order of like 3 minutes if you want to heat up some dinner, as an example. And I use it, and I like to use it for reheating my coffee. I don't like cold coffee, and I was really excited about the being able to, you know, pop my coffee in the microwave oven and give it 30 seconds. So anyway, that's it for this step. The next thing is to put the batteries back in the camper. Okay, so the last step now is just to put the batteries back. Tighten up the connections and put the blocks back in and close the door. Now, the one thing you want to make sure is you get the batteries inside the battery box the correct way around. In my case, the positive terminal goes toward the back on the left-hand side. So I want to make sure that I get that battery in the right direction. And you want to make sure that your cables, you have clearance for your cables and so on. So just a reverse of the process. So I'm going to pull that nut off the top of the positive terminal, 12 volts, which will be 12 volts, I guess. Put the put my 12 volt cable in there. And don't forget, in my case, or potentially in your case, if you have any additional voltage sense wires, and I'm going to add the voltage sense. So by the way, the you know, on a solar controller, the voltage sense wires are really useful for measuring the voltage directly at the battery to help compensate for any voltage drops that one might have along the various wiring in your camper. So the solar controller or the charger, if it's, you know, so equipped, will actually increase the voltage as needed to make up for the drop across the cables, and that becomes especially important as the current goes up. So again, I take my wrench. When you're tightening up the nuts on a battery, you don't want to crank it down real tight. The size of the wrench and the size of the nut is more to keep the size of the battery terminal large for the advantage of the current through the post, not so that you can put that kind of torque on it. So I just get it just a little snug. Okay, so that's my 12 volt wire. Now I'm going to put in my, what I call my 6 volt jumper. I want to put it in this direction, in part because I have the bend pre-bent, and also I want to keep track of my color coding here. And part of the reason I put the tape on, or I should say the heat shrink on the jumper cable, is someday if I sell my camper, I'm going to have to explain all this to a potential owner, and I figured that this may help with the process a little bit. Again, you want to just gently, just a little bit, not crazy. Okay. Okay. So then, again, you want to make sure that you don't have any obstructions behind your battery, because it does, it does jiggle around in there. And I'm going to slide that battery home. So now I have everything else. See? Okay. Now it's time to go get the other battery. On the second outer battery, we want the negative cable off to the left. Here we go. And now she's home. So the next step is to hook up the other end of the jumper to the plus terminal of the battery, which is on the right hand side. Take the nut off, bring that cable across the battery, set it on the post. Okay, and then I need to grab my other temperature sensor, put it on that terminal. Tighten it up with my finger tight. Now I can see I got a little more room to work now on the outer side here, because I got the terminals closer to the opening. See? Just a little bit snug, not crazy. And then finally, the negative terminal, I find that it's just a little easier to do if I kind of just pivot the battery out a little bit. Put the negative terminal in there, and my negative voltage sense wire for my, that's actually used, the voltage sense is actually used by three things, actually two. It's used by my solar controller, and then I also have a battery monitor, which so I can monitor the actual battery voltage from inside the camper, in addition to the current and how much charge I've gotten and so on. Which incidentally, if you're really serious about dry camping and boondocking and just being off the grid for any length of time, if you did nothing else on your camper, I would highly recommend installing a battery monitor. That's another thing I could probably do a video on too. But basically, I have a Bogart Engineering battery monitor, which works real well. And that's it. All I got to do now is insert my little blocks. You see here, this is actually a piece of redwood, which I actually had left over from a deck project years ago. And as it happens, this is a piece of treated lumber. So I can set that. I'll just set that in, and you can see, you know, it's actually pretty snug. See, things go in there nice, you know. So I'm pretty confident about that. Okay. So now I can actually close my battery box and get my key and can even lock it up. Okay, so that's it. The only thing that's left to do is to you know, turn the disconnect switch back on, and in my case with the solar panels, I got to turn the solar controller on and then turn the breaker on that connects the panels to the solar controller. And of course I have to reset the stereo. All the settings lose their minds whenever you disconnect the battery. So that's about all. And tomorrow, or the next day, if the sun's out, I'll go ahead and equalize my batteries. By the way, that's a process that takes about 4 hours. And what it does is it raises the voltage that's being presented to the batteries. So the electrolyte will actually boil off a little bit, and that's to get rid of some potential sulfation between the plates. Some manufacturers recommend doing that about every 30 days, which you can do automatically with, you know, a lot of chargers and solar controllers. But I feel like my batteries stay charged well enough that I only need to do it whenever I actually maintain a battery. So I typically equalize twice a year. Anyway, so that's it. Again, thanks for watching, and happy trails.